Hi everyone, this is Jen Medbery from Kickboard, and thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar and Q&A. The topic of today's webinar is establishing a performance-based culture at a turnaround school, and I am incredibly excited to be joined by Justin Cohen, president of the School Turnaround Group at Mass Insight Education, and we have just a full conversation and Q&A planned today. So, and it looks like we've got a packed audience as well. So excited to have everyone joining us today. We are going to start. I just want to briefly introduce Justin and a bit of background about myself, and then we're going to dive into a conversation and really learn from the wisdom that Justin has gained over the years when it comes to school culture at a turnaround school. Justin leads the school turnaround group at Mass Insight and works in a multi-year partnership zone initiative that works with state agencies, districts, as well as partner organizations to develop the strategies and the capacity necessary to turn around our nation's lowest performing schools. And I am founder and CEO of Kickboard, a school performance analytics platform for schools from kindergarten to 12th grade, and built Kickboard based on my own experience in the classroom as a middle and high school teacher. So really excited to have Justin here, and with that, just want to start with an opening question. Justin, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the School Turnaround Group.
Work, which
Hold
is
on,
our
Justin, I think you were muted just then. Can you back up and
sure.
start again? Now I can hear you.
Hi. Okay, great. First of all, thanks to Jen and for Kickboard for having me here, and thanks to all of you out there who are listening. I hope I get to answer some of your questions later. The School Turnaround Group really works, and Mass Insight Education works at 3 levels with schools, districts, and state agencies. So one is our deepest work, which is our Partnership Zone Initiative. So we work with districts to create mini districts, we call them partnership zones, inside of school districts that are clusters of chronically underperforming schools, and we try to build the systems and structures around those clusters to help them rapidly improve. We also, second, convene a network of states, which we call our State Development Network, in the interest of helping the state agencies that are so invested in working on the turnaround work to share best practices and to accelerate their reforms. And then finally, we have a sort of a field research practice, and we try to distill out what's working, what's not working in the field on school turnaround, and then share that with the broader field. And so it's a terrific organization, and I invite all of you to visit our website and to reach out if you have questions or thoughts beyond what we talk about today.
Terrific. So I'm going to start us off with a few more questions, but also want to encourage everybody who's listening in to make use of the question section of your GoToMeeting or your GoToWebinar control panel, and type in and submit questions as we as we engage in conversation. I will work them into the conversation and reserve a bit of time at the end for audience Q&A as well. So Justin, at Kickboard, we are particularly interested in helping support schools as they build or enhance a performance-based culture. And to make it easier for folks to understand what we mean by performance-based culture, we often break it down into elements. Things like data-driven teaching, emphasis on a growth mindset with students and staff, a focus on results, building a trusting and collaborative environment, transparency, consistency from classroom to classroom, etc. And you and I have had conversations before discussing how these elements can really help turn around a low-performing school. Can you share some of your thoughts about how the role of a culture of performance can or should play in a low-performing school, and how school leaders can create the right conditions for such a shift?
Sure. So we all know how difficult it is to build that performance-based culture really in any school. And the field has obviously made some big strides in the past decade or two on data, but it's still not necessarily in the DNA yet of all school organizations. And so we know that it's really challenging to do this in any school. To do this in a school that's really struggling, in a chronically underperforming school, all of those challenges are exacerbated because you have one, higher concentrations of students with greater needs, two, higher concentrations of students that are multiple grade levels behind, and three, in a lot of cases, higher concentrations of teachers who are really struggling to reach kids. And so if you're when you all the things that you normally think about in terms of building a performance culture are so challenging, it becomes even more challenging, but because of that, even more important in a turnaround environment, because you have to really break down the objectives of the school into meaningful enough short and long-term goals that you can create and sustain momentum for the turnaround period. So some of these schools are starting at single-digit proficiency in math and reading. Some of them have graduation rates well below 50%. And so you can really have those data can either be inspiring or they can cause major dips in morale and identity for the school. And the challenge and the turnaround around a performance culture is to use those as motivation and to create short and long-term goals rooted in data, rooted in performance that help you to meet the needs of kids and also to continue to sustain a culture of excellence over time. So one of the things, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some pretty daunting realities, right? I mean, if you're talking about single-digit performance when you start, it can be, I would imagine, I know from having talked to school leaders that have done this and have been at the beginning stages that, it can be overwhelming at first to take those steps towards developing a performance-driven culture across the school. Are there elements that a school should prioritize? I mean, I'm looking at some of the questions coming in. Reginald asks, suggestions for new principals at low-performing schools. Where do I start?
It's a great question, and I guess the first thing to say is that in a school that really is chronically underperforming, it's very hard to get meaningful changes in test scores even in the first year. And what often happens then is folks throw up their hands and say, oh, this school is continuing to fail because the test scores didn't go up. But we know that's not true. We know that there are some foundational things you can do to measure school culture that are only going to help you build the foundation you need to accelerate gains. So if I'm a new principal, one of the things I would look at are what are the critical leading indicators that are going to let me know that I'm on the right track. Things like increased student attendance, reduced student truancy, increased teacher attendance, because a lot of turnaround schools have real problems with teacher attendance, and then things like behavioral incidences. So you might actually see in a turnaround a spike upwards in behavior infractions. And that's okay because it might mean that you're actually just being more strict in the school about what constitutes a behavioral infraction, right? So I've been in schools where it's acceptable, or it's at least tacitly acceptable to swear in the hallways. And if you suddenly start enforcing a no swearing in the hallways policy, you might have many more sort of quote-unquote incidences, but you might actually be on the right track to instituting a much more positive learning culture. So I would say that those are just a few examples, but I think it's critical for new leaders to identify what you're going to measure that is not test scores. Because if you're just measuring test scores, it's only going to happen at the end of the year or in the beginning of the next year in some states. And by the way, that might not be the most inspiring data to get because it can take 2 years to actually see a bump. So really figuring out what to measure and then messaging that aggressively.
So, I mean, that resonates, right? Because at Kickboard, we talk with schools, they use Kickboard on a daily basis to keep track of what matters most to your school. And we operate with the philosophy that student data does mean more than just test scores. To drill a little bit deeper, can you talk more about how that data, how that data can include the behavior or the character development piece as well? You say as a school leader, you have to ask yourself, what are you going to measure? But what have you seen successful schools focus on, and how often are they looking at that data? How do they make that just really concrete?
So I think the three things I mentioned, student behavior, teacher attendance, really four things: student attendance and truancy, teacher attendance, and behavioral incidences, and then sometimes in an environment that's been deemed somewhat unsafe, incidences of violence. Those are all things that I think are sort of on on the list of things you want to see, get less bad over time, right? But then there's the positive side, right? And I think really good school leaders and school cultures include a real focus on positive reinforcement, and whether you're using PBIS or some other system, you have to find a way to measure that. So whether you have some kind of non-monetary award system that you use and that's consistent across the school, or shout-outs or props or whatever it is, I think one of the things that I see really great school leaders and school teams doing is instituting that and being really rigorous about tracking that. So, am I sort of positively reinforcing twice as many behaviors as I negatively reinforce? Really getting intentional about that and trying to figure out how to do that, I think, is important. So I think that's one place where folks aren't really used to using data a lot, even if they're using it to track test scores. To say, okay, now I want you to track, by the way, and I do believe that test scores are important and formative assessments are important, but figuring out how to add on to that, the measurement of all of those behavioral aspects is really tricky because a lot of them happen in the moment. And so to ask a teacher who's already managing a complex classroom and it has very little time for prep to then say, okay, I also want you to track, how often you positively reinforce a behavior you like, you might find that folks struggle with that. And so I think figuring out as a school leader which things are important and making it easy enough for teachers to do is probably the challenge. And there's no silver bullet to that, but I think it's worth doing.
I think that's a really important point, that regardless of the system you have in place and the communication structures you put around that system and around using the data, there is no silver bullet. And from a leader's perspective, it does take just commitment and discipline to make sure that you're constantly revisiting the data and using it to drive conversations amongst your staff. So I think that's a really important point. As more questions come in from the audience, I think we have a lot of folks out there who are responsible for multiple schools. So Justin wanted to ask, for you to offer some insights into how scale of
Jen, you're breaking up a little bit
across a cluster of schools.
I actually missed like the middle of that. Your
Sure.
voice what got robotic.
Yeah, I'll ask that again. I was just commenting on how, your point that there's no silver bullet is really important, that it's critical for a school leader to be disciplined and consistent in constantly revisiting the data, and whatever tool or technology or system you have in place to capture the data is only as good as the structures you're putting in place around it
Sure.
to talk about the data. So that's important. And then, to sort of move forward in our conversation, I think from the questions coming in, I think we have a lot of listeners who are actually responsible for the performance of multiple schools. And so I wanted to ask you, Justin, to offer some insights into how you would scale a culture of performance across a cluster of schools.
It's a terrific question, and it's one that's really important to me because I do think you're most likely to get results where you're clustering for impact. So I think one of the most challenging things and the most critical things to do when dealing with a cluster is to find meaningful time and place for folks to meet in either vertically or horizontally integrated settings. So, all of the math teachers in a cluster of schools, and then also time for all of the, from K to 12 or whatever the grade span is, and also all the teachers at a certain grade level. Because the teachers at the grade level need to talk for the obvious reasons that they are all seeing a similar cohort of kids potentially, and they can share information about kids' relative performance across different teachers' learning environments. The vertical integration, I think, is something that happens less often, especially across schools. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've asked middle school teachers whether they know it's being taught at the high school they're feeding kids into, and they kind of shrug. So I think finding a way to get teachers across schools that are serving the same kids eventually, but not currently, to talk about the things you'll need to know in ninth grade, so that the 7th and 8th grade math teachers know what they're doing to prepare those kids. So I think figuring out what the interim benchmarks are that folks need to hit, or that kids need to hit in order to be prepared, is something that is incumbent upon a leader of a cluster. So if, let's use, I'll stick with math as the example. If we know we want a large chunk of kids to take calculus by the time they're in 11th or 12th grade, how does the cluster performance specialist or data specialist or whomever determine what you're going to need to be doing content-wise in 6th and 7th grade to get there? And that's a big challenge. Fortunately, the Common Core helps us with this. But I think, but measuring it and figuring out what are the right assessments to use, what are the right dipsticks, that only happens if you're looking across an entire cluster of schools. So I think that is really important. Again, particularly vertically, because I think we're less used to doing that.
Yeah. So that's interesting, to play devil's advocate, which is my favorite role to play when I get to lead webinars like this. I mean, I hear you about the importance of alignment, but stepping into the role of a school leader for a moment, I mean, given all of the urgent concerns that school leaders, turnaround schools have, things coming at them on a daily basis, how do you convince them that the idea of alignment, whether horizontal or vertical, is something they need to prioritize? I mean, for those who say, I've got much bigger fish to fry, why is that worth the work? How do you make that feasible?
So it's a great question. I think that, one, I can't tell you how many high school teachers I've talked to and high school principals I've talked to who say, if I just got fewer ninth graders who are multiple grade levels behind, I would be more successful. And this is an opportunity to sort of put your money where your mouth is on that, because the way to make sure that fewer kids are coming in grade levels behind is to reach down and make sure that you're actively working with the feeder schools to make sure that kids are on grade level. So that's one, and that's self-interest, because that is a direct connection between the kind of data you produce at that level and the kind of data and the work of doing vertical integration. But
yeah,
two,
I mean,
sort
so
of
Justin, going.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to probe a little. Yeah, so specific. I mean, what does that look like? I mean, I can envision pretty creative professional development, collaborative scope and sequence planning. Does that happen in the summer? Is that happening throughout the school year when you've got ninth grade teachers working with 7th and 8th grade teachers? I mean, are there examples that you can share from some of the schools where you've seen it work in action? Because often it's the little details about how to make that run successfully.
So I think doing as much of the scope and sequence work in the summer as possible is important, and so that's the time where there's not a lot of other distractions, and you can really dig into unpacking and understanding how the standards and curriculum at different levels impact folks that are not necessarily teaching that, but will be teaching the relevant work at a different grade level or in different subjects. So I think that a lot of it has to happen in the summer. But I think what needs to happen on an ongoing basis is a review of relevant data. So if I'm a ninth grade English teacher, I'm going to have vested interest on 8th grade ELA formative assessments. Because there ought to be time to do that, and so I don't know if it needs to be as frequent as teaming in a school, but folks should potentially, like, you might think about reaching out, and if you're in a high school, let's say you're a middle school this time, and that there are quarterly benchmark assessments for ELA at the elementary level, you should program into the school during PD time, within a week or two after the elementary schools get the results of those assessments to meet and to determine what the 4th and 5th graders are doing and getting, because again, those are going to be your kids and not too long.
Of the time, I want to use the remaining 5 to 7 minutes to take some of the questions coming in from our audience, and I'm going to bring it back down to the building level for a moment and talk about change management. Change is hard, as you mentioned, Justin. What are some specific ways you've seen school leaders build investment amongst teachers who may be resistant
So one thing I think that's so critical is the celebration of early wins, because turnaround schools start so far behind. If celebration only happens when you're at parity with comparable schools or in the top quartile of the state, you'll be waiting for years in some cases. So I think figuring out, and this is the same as you might see in any change framework in other sectors, but finding out what you think you expect to happen within the first year that's worth celebration at the beginning, and then really angling towards that and then celebrating it is critical. So I think that's one way to generate buy-in, is to make folks feel like their work is meaningful and that something is actually happening. So that's one. Two is don't ignore excellence. So I think what ends up happening in a lot of turnaround cultures is you're so focused on raising the floor that you ignore raising the ceiling or raising the roof, as some of our partners like to say. And so just because you're really focused on remediation and really focused on flipping the culture, if you ignore too long excellent teaching and excellent performance, and don't actually invest in those things, so things like advanced placement, things like gifted programs, things like like successful clubs and out of school and out of the core curriculum type stuff, you'll lose morale, because I think it'll just feel like a long slog. So I think those are two examples, but I think it's really worth figuring out how to get those interim wins and then celebrate them. Otherwise, folks are going to get and stay exhausted.
It's interesting that you emphasize the need to celebrate those accomplishments along the way. The webinars, this webinar is part of a series, and we had a data coach from public middle school in Louisiana on last month who really said much of the same thing, that you have to if moving to a more data-driven instructional approach is something new for teachers, start with the small wins and celebrate, just the sheer tracking of data, and celebrate the conversations that you're having, and build momentum in order to see, the results down the line. So I think that's really important. And sort of bringing that back around to what you talked about earlier with respect to, if test scores are the only thing you measure, you're not going to see, evidence of growth until the very end of the year, and so it's critically important to measure metrics around cultural factors in the building, attendance, truancy, and behavior. Are there ways that you've seen principals get teachers invested in keeping track of these new metrics, or metrics that may be newer to them at first?
Well, one way is to just make it more fun, which sounds silly, but I think matters. I think if you can actually make something fun to do and create your own language and culture around it, it's valuable. So, I'm trying to think of a specific example right now, but if you name the system something goofy, and you call it if you're going to Walnut Street Elementary School, you call them Walnut Points or something, and the kids get and teachers give out little paper walnuts or whatever, or if it's more sophisticated online, you have like some kind of reward system where it's you have your own language and culture around it. I think that makes a difference, and it sounds cheesy, but I think cheesy really works, because folks talk about it and they create their own inside jokes about it, and you can basically get folks excited about it because they know that it's fun and meaningful at the same time. I think that's one way. It's just not making it so dry, and because I think one of the criticisms you might hear of a performance or data culture is that it makes things drier and less fun and emotional, and doesn't need to be true. You can have just as much fun celebrating something, but you have to be intentional about doing that. And I think so. One of the things I think about in culture is one of the things I think drives culture in any organization, schools in particular, is shared language, and so making sure that there's shared language around it, and it can be a little goofy and fun.
Yeah, I mean that, certainly like the walnut points or whatever, like that shared language is really important. Unified staff into one team. And the work we do supporting schools at Kickboard, who envisioned that sort of school-wide consistent data tracking system, shudder at the thought of issuing paper-based point systems and want to digitize it. And I think one related powerful benefit to that most people don't realize at first is that when you're centralizing it in a really secure digital platform, you're breaking down those walls and those barriers from one classroom to the other and letting teachers share in their peers and their colleagues' accomplishments as well. So success is no longer trapped in just the classroom. Well, great. So I think we I think we're just about to run out of time. I know we got started a few minutes late, so I'm just going to ask one final question and then make sure to thank everyone and give you some links where you can go for more information. But one last question coming in from the audience, Justin, is cultural mandates.
Jen, I can't hear you.
And the mandates. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now, Justin?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Great. So I was just going to say we've got time for one more question. I wish we could get to all of the ones in the audience, but this is, I think, relevant for the teachers listening. Culture, the mandate for improvement often comes from above. What can individual teachers do to promote a performance-driven culture?
Oh, I think that's a great question. So one is, even if there's not a mandate from above, it doesn't mean that you can't be a leader amongst your peers and create your own kind of performance-based culture with your peers that want to buy in. And so I think coming up with shared systems across classrooms, it doesn't need to be the work of leadership. It should be, and certainly it's better, I think, in a lot of ways if it is owned at the top. But if you're a teacher and you and your grade level peers want to create something that is common across classrooms and that is more open and that you can share, I think you should do that. And I think teachers should view themselves as having a bigger impact beyond the classroom, or a broader impact beyond the classroom they're in. That's one. And then two is vesting the kids in it, because I think if you can get the kids in your classroom and beyond your classroom vested in the idea of tracking their own performance, that's going to last well beyond the time they spend in your classroom, and they'll carry that with them for their whole lives. And in the best case scenarios, they'll demand it from more of their teachers and leaders around them, and will come to expect that. And I think when kids expect something more of us as educators, that we're doing work that sort of transcends any one of us individually. And so I think that's incredibly important as well. And you can do that, and you can intentionally tell students to ask for more.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Justin, as well as to all of the attendees who've listened in and joined us this afternoon. Such great wisdom and insight from Justin, so I really appreciate you taking the time to share. And for those that have joined or about the School Turnaround Group, I encourage you to visit the links that are on your screen. And we'll follow up in the next week or so. So thanks everyone for your time, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you for having me.